Hi, I'm James Verdier, and welcome to the American Institute of Biological Sciences BioScience Talks, which is a forum for integrating the life sciences. For today's episode, I was joined by journalist Paul Koberstein, who is here to discuss his first book, which is called Canopy of Titans. It's about the connection between forests and climate. You'll find a link with more information in the show notes, but I very much encourage you to pick up a copy. I love the book. It was an absolute pleasure to read, and I also had a great time discussing it with Paul. So with no further ado, let's go to the interview. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Good morning. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to be talking today about Canopy of Titans, and I was wondering if you would just give us a little bit of an introduction to the book and, perhaps to the great North American temperate rainforest. What's it like up there?
First thing I want to do is give a shout out to my co-author, Jessica Applegate, who sadly couldn't be here today. She's actually at a job. But she did a great job with researching, writing, editing, and so on, rewriting my dense prose, if you will. So Canopy of Titans is about the connection between forest and climate, right? So the point is that if we ever hope to stabilize the climate, protecting forests, especially older forests, the ones that store the most carbon, is going to be essential. Now, this isn't something that a bunch of tree huggers dreamed up last week. There's an awful lot of science that backs this up. Trees have been stabilizing the climate for thousands and thousands of years. They absorb carbon dioxide from the air, which is carbon and oxygen molecule, and keep the carbon and spit out the oxygen. So a tree is half carbon. And we've heard, everyone of course knows that we need to stop burning fossil fuels if we hope to stabilize the climate. We need to switch to renewables like solar and wind, driving electric cars, stuff like that. The big revelation in the book is that if that's all we do, if all we do is stop burning fossil fuels, that won't be enough. The reason for that is we've been dumping massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the air for the last 3 centuries, on the order of 1,100 extra gigatons of carbon dioxide. So we need to remove much of that if we hope to return to a stable climate. So after reading dozens and dozens of scientific papers, Jessica and I came to the conclusion that the way to do that is to protect forests. Forests are the only thing that is capable of removing this dangerous legacy carbon from the air at an affordable cost and at the necessary scale. Now, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, why don't we just develop some kind of carbon capture technology? But so far, and I'm telling you, it's not working. I mean, at best, they're removing 0.1% of the annual carbon emissions, and this is less than a drop in the bucket. So the next thing that you need to know is that we have forests that can do the job at that scale, at the affordable cost. And older forests are key, and there's all kinds of reasons for that, but basically it's because older forests are absorbing carbon at a faster rate. Out here in the west coast of North America, where they have the biggest trees, the tallest trees in the world, the most carbon-dense forests in the world, it does a great job at sequestering carbon. So when you log a forest, and I'm not saying we shouldn't log forests, but if we do log a forest, you emit almost all of the carbon in the tree. Now, some of the carbon is emitted back to the air immediately, but the rest of it goes back to the air over time, most of it. Within a century, about 80% of a tree's carbon is back in the air. There's a professor at Tufts University in Boston, a guy named William Mumma, who coined a term for the idea of protecting forests as a climate solution. He called it proforestation. So we wrote about climate and forest through the lens of this forest on the West Coast, which we call the Pacific Coastal Temperate Rainforest. So we're focused on the largest temperate rainforest on Earth, which is on the Pacific Coast of North America, which is where I live. It's in my backyard, and I've lived here pretty much all my life. It stretches from San Francisco, the Redwoods, north to Alaska, to the Gulf of Alaska, 2,500 miles, one forest. And as I said, it's the world's most carbon-dense ecosystem. That means that an acre of this forest stores more carbon than anywhere else on Earth. On average, it stores right around 3 times the amount of carbon in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. You may not know, but the Amazon is not very carbon dense. It has a lot of carbon because it's so big, but on an acre per acre basis, this rainforest on the west coast of North America has much, much more carbon.
No, that's really interesting. And, something that strikes me now, speaking with you as well as when I was reading the book, is the fact that this is an old growth forest. And, I think we've all heard the arguments that old growth forests hold a static amount of carbon. And, they are, in that sense, relatively unimportant for carbon sequestration purposes. But one of the things that you discuss is the fact that that's not really true at all. And in cases like this one, the fact that it's an old growth forest is actually an incredible asset in terms of its ability to store carbon.
So here on the West Coast, we have these gigantic trees, and I mean the tallest trees in the world. We have trees that are over 300 feet tall. We even had trees over 400 feet tall, but they were cut down back in the 1800s, 1890s or something. Um, but an old growth forest stores far more carbon per acre than a younger forest. I mean, people talk about planting trees. Why don't we plant trees? And in fact, the timber industry likes to say they have an ad. They're running an ad out here on TV. We cut down an old tree. We will plant three young ones for every old tree we cut down. And the problem with that is the math. These small trees aren't going to hold as much carbon as the old one tree they cut down for decades, 100 years or so. Um, the ancient Chinese told us the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the next best time is today. But if you want to time travel, the best time to plant a tree was 1,000 years ago, and the best thing you can do today is save a tree.
Right. That makes sense, of course. And it kind of comes out throughout the book that there's this powerful desire, within the forest industry to take down these old growth forests and cut them for use in timber products or, even, burning them for heat. Is the appeal for them similar to what makes, these forests a good carbon storage? Is just that you've got a high density of wood that they can extract? Is it massively more profitable for them to extract from an old growth forest than, something that's newer growth or what might be called a tree farm or something like that?
Yeah, it must be because they cut down in this rainforest here, 80% of all the old growth is gone, and that's been cut down. They will replant it with a tree farm and then grow it. And then economics tells them to reharvest that forest in about 30 to 40 years. And they can make some money doing that. And Wall Street kind of demands that. Um, but a forest will maximize its lumber production if you let it grow till 80 or 120 or so years. Who wants to wait 100 years for the profits to roll in? No one lives that long, pretty much. So they cut it down, and they they've they're good at this. They cut it down every 40 years and then spray and plant new ones, and again repeat the cycle over and over again. So all that carbon is lost from an old growth forest, and it's never recaptured by the new growth.
Yeah, and I thought one of the the interesting points you mentioned was that a lot of this carbon rather is stored in the the forest soils, and you don't have that same sort of storage capacity within a newer growth forest.
This is a really good point. I'm glad you brought it up. So yeah, let's say a forest grows for 1,000 years, which is not that unusual here, or at least before the timber industry got a hold of these forests. But say it grows for 1,000 years, and then it falls over, it dies in a forest fire, is blown over by the wind or whatever. The next 1,000 years, it's going to store that carbon, or most of it, as it slowly decays. And so there's science that shows about half or even more than half of the total carbon pool in an old growth forest is going to be in the soil, in the woody debris on the ground, in old logs and branches and leaves and stuff. As those decay, but they will still store carbon for a while, for a long while. In many cases, an old log can sit there for 1,000 years while it rots. So those are gone. I mean, those are burned by the timber industry that as slash when they log, and that all goes up in smoke.
Yeah, that's a great point. Can you talk a little bit about the sort of those greenwashing efforts and the ways in which you wind up with quote unquote protected forests that are, legal under the law is or perceived as doing something, in the name of conservation, but they may not actually in practice be doing that at all.
Um, I did a piece for an Earth Island Journal a couple of months ago that got into this in some detail, where we actually found a group that was a timber industry funded group that was collaborating with academia and government to greenwash the idea that cutting down forests, logging older forests is good for the climate. It's better to put the carbon in a plank of plywood than it is to keep it in a tree. And the industry is going whole hog over this issue, this idea. Um, it's wrong. And as I mentioned, there's academic participation in these groups. This one group has like 17 members from different big universities around the country, including Yale, University of Washington, University of Maine, um, Oregon State. So they're pouring a lot of money into trying to persuade the public into accepting logging as a solution for the climate, and they might be getting away with it. But then we have, of course, Trump, who knows that the climate is going off a cliff, but he just doesn't care, and so his plan is to log every tree he can, and we'll see if he gets away. He's reversing what's called the roadless rule, which is a rule that protected old forests across the country, put in place in 2000 by Bill Clinton. And if Trump has this way, and he usually does, it seems, because Congress goes along with everything he says, then that option is foreclosed. So you have industry and government, collaborating with industry and academia to not just log, but to basically lie about it, to spread misinformation about what they're doing and the impacts of all of that.
Yeah, and I think we may have chatted about it already a little bit, but what's the proportion of carbon storage in a global sense that occurs in this particular 2,500-mile long temperate forest, and what's the stake here in terms of our emission versus our emissions, and those sorts of things? How big a deal is this forest in particular?
There was a paper by a professor at the University of Vermont a couple of years ago that compared the carbon storage in old forests by region around the world. And the Pacific Northwest forest came out on top easily. The most carbon dense forest in the world is the redwoods in California. Behind that, in number two is actually there's a eucalyptus forest near Melbourne, Australia, and they're followed by the Douglas fir forest in Oregon and Washington. So the the carbon density of this forest is by and large above everywhere else. But because it's 2,500 miles in size, you've got a lot of carbon here. So if you want trees for logging, and you want to protect the climate, you would choose trees that are growing outside of this region, outside of the highly carbon dense regions of the world.
Yeah, so I mean, the preference would be, being that there is some desire for wood products and et cetera, to conduct that in an area that's perhaps already been depleted, or it's not an old growth forest. It's not going to be an old growth forest. There are probably areas that are, capable of being productive for those purposes that are not, playing such a vital role in, maintaining the Earth's temperature.
Well, certainly there's, as I said, there's, 80% of the old growth forest out here is gone, replaced by tree farms. So they have, for tree farms, for producing the lumber and all the other wood products that we need, 80% of the land, 80% of the former forest, old growth forest, is now in production for these products. So, my question is, isn't that enough? Don't we have the capacity to save the last 20% for the climate. And so that's what we're looking at, the proportion of 80 to 20.
That makes sense. And I was hoping we could chat a little bit about the indigenous communities who have, been the traditional stewards of this forest and, the waterways that run through it. And just discuss a little bit the way that, their story is intertwined with the rest of the story, and the logging and exploitation of these wildernesses.
And we spent an entire section of the book on the indigenous aspects of this. When the white settlers came to the west coast of North America, there were, a couple 100,000 native people who were living there. And so the idea was, well, if we sign treaties with the native people, we can trade their land. They can trade their land for promises of support, protection, land, and so on. Many of these treaties were never ratified by the U.S. Senate, and so they just disappeared. The government kept the land, gave them nothing in return, and in some cases, when they got reservations, they moved lots and lots of people onto these reservations. In the early years, many of these people died. In one case, half the people at on this reservation died. We tell the story of this one family, one native family in Southern Oregon. The great grandfather was a chief in what's called the Coos tribe. He was one of the signers of one of the first treaties on the Oregon coast. His wife was taken by the U.S. Army and relocated to this. I was going to say concentration camp. That's not the word, but it is much like a concentration camp. But it was a horrible situation. And she escaped and swam around a rocky outcrop in the Pacific Ocean with the U.S. Army soldiers hot on her heels. She slept in logs and finally made her way back 100 miles to her family and was able to survive the ordeal. And we know about this because her great grandson, a guy named George Wasson, wrote about it in his academic papers. And her grandson, who went to Carlisle Law School in Pennsylvania, took the case, was hired by a bunch of tribes to take this case to the Supreme Court, to try to reclaim the land or at least get some compensation for it. And he actually won. And we tell the entire story in our book, and it's quite an ordeal. So you have this theft of land, but there's also genocide, and it's a story that's been repeated time and again across North America.
Right, and those are some very devastating stories that are told. I thought extremely thoughtfully within the book. Um,
Thank you.
and I'm wondering, a little bit about the experience, that you and your co-author had in writing this book. So you said the effort began in 2018, and I noted that a lot of a lot of what you're talking about just spans the pandemic. And I was just wondering, about how this book came into being, and how you wound up now, with the book out, across that very challenging period of time.
You mentioned the pandemic, and so we have one chapter to talk about our trip to British Columbia to go check out the forest up there. And this was, gosh, probably around April or May 2020. And the province was completely closed. You couldn't get into British Columbia. So we had to do our reporting um, through the internet. Fortunately, the people in Canada were really good at using drones and flyovers to capture video of what was going on. So we could see in real time pretty much what was happening. Um, in our neck of the woods at the same time, um, Oregon's forests were burning down like crazy. There was a series of mega fires that hit our state around September 2020. And the air was just, in fact, we leave the book off with this anecdote where the air was completely unbreathable. It was amazing. There's five of the largest forest fires, in Oregon history happening all at the same time around Labor Day of 2020. So a year later, as we continue working on this book, um, we had what was called a heat dome. It was a brutal heat dome that settled over Portland, in which, Portland is very moderate weather, has very moderate weather, rarely get over 100 degrees in temperature. This heat dome came on us like by surprise. And at the worst, it had temperatures in some areas of Portland, 124 degrees. Unbelievable. I couldn't even walk down the street. It was just too bloody hot. Um, I think the New York Times calculated that the odds of that happening in Portland was at the statistical equivalent of zero. Impossible without human caused climate change. I mean, these were not isolated events. I mean, similar disasters are occurring all the time around the world due to climate change. I mean, droughts and so on, hurricanes. Hurricanes may not be caused by climate change directly, but the data shows that they're made far worse and maybe more frequent. And of course, that the rising levels of sea levels are just another example of what's happening. But it was really important for us to experience what was going on a personal level as we were writing this book. It's quite an ordeal.
Yeah, I can imagine it must have been very difficult to, experience those changes at the same time you're writing about trying to mitigate them by saving this forest. I'm wondering now about what our listeners might do if they find themselves interested in participating and trying to be a part of the preservation of this forest, which is obviously so important both for, climate change mitigation, but also for biodiversity. I remember reading in your book about, the orca pod that had been forced to relocate and wasn't doing as well because of the damage that had occurred to some salmon runs, within the forest. So what are kind of the outlets and things that are available for people to do at this stage now if they would like to take a part?
Yeah, this is the challenge, isn't it? I mean, how do you protect a forest that is being targeted by, a timber industry that is, lying about what it's doing, and a government that is eager to give the industry whatever it wants. There are a number of organizations that have come up and are working on this in this region, and their mantra, if you will, is forest defense is climate defense. People are protecting forests for the climate, not just for biodiversity, and it's pretty heartening. You mentioned salmon. One scientist found that the trees that are growing near salmon spawning sites grow 3 times faster than trees further away. And so protecting salmon is another way to protect the climate. And that's one thing we didn't know when we started writing this book is that, it's not just trees, it's salmon. And you can protect salmon by not, of course, catching them or destroying their habitat, but also it turns out that salmon rely on beaver to thrive and to grow. One of the things that we found in our research is that there's a study that salmon helping to increase. I mean, beavers are helping to increase the salmon population by building dams in estuaries. Young salmon that spend time there as smolts are 3 times more likely to survive into adulthood. We also talk about orca and how they fit into this whole um, ecosystem, and there's definitely a connection between salmon and orca too. So, um,
Yeah, I think the book does a really fantastic job of capturing that, interreliance of the different elements of the ecosystem and of course our reliance on them too, and the, consequent imperative to preserve everything that we can because we're reliant on all of it ourselves. But one last question I had, and it may be too early for this question, and I will not be upset if you're not willing to answer it. But you mentioned before we started chatting about a sequel to this book, and I was hoping that you might be willing to give us a bit of a preview of that.
yeah, that's true. I'm sure Jessica's involved in this, but um, the subject of misinformation is a big deal, and we want to kind of get into that, investigate what's going on. One of the chapters is going to be on bioenergy. There's a company based in England that's been aggressively logging in the southern United States, from Virginia to Texas to make wood pellets that are being exported to Europe and Asia for energy. And one of the companies there, Drax, used to operate the largest coal burning plant in Western Europe. A few years ago, they converted the plant to burn wood pellets instead and called it renewable energy. And it's, a climate solution. But the problem with that is it's a farce. Burning wood pellets releases more carbon dioxide than coal. One study said 20%. A European study said 4 times as much. Either way, it's a farce. And the other thing is that there's a lot of countries, including our own, that are subsidizing wood pellets, bioenergy, as a renewable source of energy. Um, it turns out that climate is better off if we just burn coal than wood pellets. And the wood pellet industry would not exist without massive government subsidies. So the reason I bring this up is that Drax is now trying to expand its operations into the Pacific coastal rainforest, into Oregon and Washington. It's already got a toehold in British Columbia, where it is logging old growth forests, in part to burn in power furnaces in Europe and Asia. And they're lying about it. So the second book is going to be on misinformation and deceit, deception, and greenwashing by this one industry. I mean, we've seen it in the fossil fuel industry with, the Heartland Institute. Um, the playbook was actually written by the tobacco industry in the 1950s, where they denied the link between cancer and tobacco. And they're doing the same thing. The timber industry is doing the same thing with regard to its operations and climate.
Yeah, we'll certainly look forward to that book, and I'm looking forward to reading it, and I'm hoping I can talk you into coming back on when that book is out. And also, one last thing I wanted to mention, before we close off today, is that this is a very well-written book, and I really recommend it to all of our listeners. It's rare that you encounter a book that's meticulously well-researched and footnoted and edited, but also really fun to read. And I very much enjoyed it. And so, of course, I recommend it to all to read it. And I just want to thank you for joining me today, and I hope to have you back one day as well.
Thank you so much, James. It's been, again, an honor to be on your show and to talk about it. It's a tough topic, but if you get into it, you realize that there's a solution here that we really need to focus on. It's not just doom and gloom. The book is not just doom and gloom. There is a solution we talk about, and a doable solution. It's just as easy as protecting forest.
Absolutely, and I hope this book goes a long way, to galvanizing that support for that effort. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And that concludes this episode of BioScience Talks. Just a reminder, the journal BioScience is published by Oxford University Press on behalf of the American Institute of Biological Sciences and is made possible by the support of our members and donors. Thank you, and talk to you next time.